When we built the jetty, the spired monument of what Dhamma did, the architect was a fan of Eero Saarinen, the Finnish architect. The lines were very clean, very graceful. A couple years later, John Fuang and I flew around the world, came to America to visit my family, among other things. We flew into Dulles Airport in Washington, which had also been designed by Saarinen. And that was back in the days when you landed at Dulles and you went right into the main terminal, which has that big roof that's shaped like a hammock. And so I pointed it out to John Fuang, thought he might be interested. He took one glance at it, didn't say anything. That was it. So I figured he wasn't interested. A couple of weeks later, though, when we got back to Thailand, I found out that he had described the roof in great detail to the architect, talking about how it was an amazing piece of architecture. I mention this just to point out that John Fuang was extremely observant. He could glance at something very quickly and take it all in. So think about that when you hear that his meditation's instructions tended to boil down to two things. One, be observant, and two, use your ingenuity. Really be observant. Understand cause and effect. Watch what you're doing. Watch the results very carefully. And if they're good, keep it up. If not, you've got to figure out how to change. He talked about one time when he was a young monk just getting started. And the meditation instructions back in those days were very simple. He didn't have a John Lee's 7 steps because John Lee hadn't formulated the 7 steps yet. The basic instructions were just to get the mind to settle down. Or in Thai it was basically to bring the mind down. Ao Chit Hai Lung. So he thought about getting it down, down, down. And I got it very heavy and very unpleasant. So I figured, this must not be right. So turn it around. How about to bring it up, 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 up? So he brought it up. That wasn't right either. So he found the right balance eventually. But it meant that he thought about things, tried to find solutions to the problems. And that became the basic pattern of his meditation. You see this throughout the forest tradition, the emphasis on thinking. There's a great passage in Ajahn Mahabua. There had been a controversy in Bangkok. There was a group that claimed that nirvana was your true self. And so a lot of scholarly monks came out and said, no, nirvana is not self. And the controversy became so heated that it actually got into the newspapers. Can you imagine? The New York Post running articles on whether nirvana is self or not self. That's basically what you had in Thailand, even the ordinary everyday newspapers, not the highly regarded ones, got involved in that fray. And so someone took the question of Ajahn Mahabua and asked him whether nirvana was self or not self. His answer was, nirvana is nirvana. Self, not self, these are perceptions. You use these perceptions on the path. But after all, when you get to nirvana, you've got to let go of all perceptions. And as he was delivering this answer, he kept saying, Picharana, which in Thai basically means think, use your brains. So it's a theme throughout the forest tradition. Of course, it's a theme in the Buddha's teachings. He talks about how to listen to the Dhamma and bring it into the practice. You start out by listening well. As he says, you lend ear. You actually try to remember what you've heard. And then you try to penetrate the meaning. In other words, figure out what it means. And then you contemplate it. Ponder it, he says, until it makes sense. It's either that it fits in with the rest of the Dharma, that you've learned how it fits in with the rest of the Dharma, because it is supposed to fit in. As the Buddha said, that's one of the tests for Dhamma, is that it's consistent. It leads consistently to certain goals. It has its atta, A-T-T-H-A. It all has to work together to aim to that goal of release. Once you see that it makes sense, then it gives rise to a desire to practice, and then a willingness to submit yourself to what you've learned. And there he says you contemplate. So you don't just ponder to make sure that it makes sense, but you contemplate how it's going to apply in your own case. You've got to think this through. Because you hear Dharma talk and often it deals in generalities or general principles that are okay for people at large. As we pointed out yesterday, generally I give the advice that you don't try to force the breath into different parts of the body, but there are times, there are exceptions, and sometimes you find you're dealing with an exception. So be alive to that. Contemplate that. Use your ingenuity, and then put forth effort. So the effort has to rely on your thinking powers. There's no place where the Buddha ever says that the rational mind is an enemy, or the rational mind gets in the way. It's all supposed to make sense. And if it doesn't make sense, you have to ask yourself, okay, where is my sense of sense lacking here? Because it all fits. One prominent case where people interpret the Dharma so it doesn't fit is where they interpret mindfulness as being a broad, accepting, open state of mind, where you don't make any choices, don't pass any judgments. Whereas with concentration and right effort, you have to develop certain states of the mind, reject other states. And the question is, how can you do all of those at the same time? Because after all, the path is supposed to come together. One solution that somebody proposed was that the Buddha actually taught two paths. There was a six-fold path and a seven-fold path. But that doesn't make any sense. You have to go back and see, well, the definitions were wrong. Mindfulness is not an open, accepting state of mind. Mindfulness has its agendas. You're trying to keep something in mind. You're trying to, in the case of the body in and of itself, like with the breath right now. And you're ardent, alert, and mindful. Alert means alert to what's going on, what you're doing, the results you're getting. And ardent, you're trying to do this well, trying to do this skillfully. As the Buddha said, when mindfulness is a governing principle in your practice, if there's anything unskillful that's there, you try to get rid of it. If there's anything that's skillful that hasn't developed yet, you try to give rise to it. And when it's there, you try to maintain it. In other words, instead of watching things coming and going, arising and passing away without interfering, you're actively trying to get good qualities to arise and trying to prevent them from passing away. When you understand mindfulness that way, then it fits perfectly in with right effort and right concentration. Because right concentration is the result of this. And right effort, of course, is there in the ardency. So think. And try to think in a way that solves the problems. A lot of people use their thinking to create problems. And the Buddha shows basically how to think in his treatment of questions that are to be answered categorically, those that have to be analyzed before you answer them, those that require cross-questioning, and those should be put aside. One of the important parts of just developing your discernment is that you learn which kind of question falls into which category. To realize there are some issues that no matter how much you think about them, they're not going to get you anywhere on the path. Other questions have to be answered in a straightforward way. You have to figure that out. And you have to develop the discernment that the Buddha says is like an archer's skills. Able to shoot far distances, able to fire shots in rapid succession, able to pierce great masses. firing shots in rapid succession, he says, is basically seeing the Four Noble Truths. What this means is you watch the mind and notice when it's creating stress and when it's not creating stress, because sometimes it goes back and forth very quickly. You can gain an insight and immediately latch onto it. Okay, the insight was good as part of the path, but then the latching onto it was going to cause more suffering, which is why you have to be quick. As far as shooting far distances, that's seeing implications. There's that passage in the Not Self discourse where the Buddha talks about how you look at 5 aggregates and you see that they're inconstant, stressful, not self. But then you don't stop there. You think about the implications. Whatever you remember from the past, about even if you remember past lives, it just comes down to these 5 aggregates. And wherever you might go in the future of this life and the future of other lives, it's going to be composed of these same aggregates. You think about the implications of that. You realize that no matter where you'd go, no matter what you would latch onto, it's not worth latching onto. You think about the consequences. You think about the implications. And as you think about them, that insight into how the aggregates right here in the present moment are not worth latching onto makes you less and less inclined to want to come back at all. Makes you more and more inclined to want to get out. Okay, that desire to get out, that comes from the fact that you've thought. And finally, piercing great messages, you're able to pierce your ignorance. In other words, when you're looking at something and you see that there's stress, okay, well, turn around and look inside. That's where the big mass of ignorance is. Our attention, for the most part, gets directed outside, outside, outside. Even when we're practicing meditation, we're watching certain events in the mind. But who's doing the watching? And do the observations about what you're watching, do they apply to the watcher as well? Well, they do. That's where the ignorance is. To turn around and look. If you develop this all-around set of skills, then your thinking really does lead to discernment, and the discernment does lead to release. I mean, look at the canon. All those suttas, all that analysis. This is not the fruit of a mind that didn't think. The Buddha thought very carefully, thought very skillfully, thought with a lot of circumspection. So when you meditate and you're reflecting on what you're doing, you've got to learn how to think. Think in a way that cuts to the chase, sees things as they're happening, and doesn't create a lot of needless issues. Years back, I remember one of my students had gone to a retreat with a John who liked to talk about life as an interplay of the relative and the absolute, and sent everybody home to contemplate their lives as an interplay of the relative and the absolute. And so my student came and she asked a question about this, and the question was so convoluted that I had to stop her. I said, look, just drop that issue. It's not useful. Because it's dealing in abstractions, and the Buddha didn't deal in abstractions. He dealt in watching realities, watching actions, and watching their results. Those are things you can look at without the abstractions. And you can see this action causes stress. This action leads away from stress. Keep it simple like that. That's when you know that you're using your thinking powers in the right way.